Hello, everyone, and welcome to This World, which comes to you this week from the United States. And I can tell you all week long, here in North America, headlines have been dominated by that big story of an escalating row between India and Canada. That after that extraordinary statement made by Justin Trudeau in Canadian Parliament, accusing India of being behind the assassination of what he described as a Canadian citizen, but a person who's been named, including an Interpol Red Corner notice, as a terrorist, certainly a militant. We're going to take a look at that entire row, which continues to escalate. The countries have issued travel advisories. India has suspended visa services in Canada. India is obviously really furious about this. Diplomats have been expelled on both sides. The Canadian presence in India is being scaled down. The rest of the world, and specifically the West, are sort of scratching their head and trying to figure out how do they deal with this? Because after all, for the West, India is fast becoming a really important ally whom they're wanting to court. They're wanting to make sure that India becomes one of the bulwarks against China, but at the same time, Canada is part of the G7, part of Five Eyes, and has been a close ally. So the big question that is being asked here in the United States and in other countries in the West, how do we deal with this? How do we play with this? And I think everyone is also waiting with bated breath to see, does Justin Trudeau have any evidence at all for the charges and the accusations he's made? Because they are serious accusations. We'll take a look at all of that a little later in this program. We're also going to get top guests and top experts to talk about that. But let me start with the big story of the week. Justin Trudeau comes to Parliament and says India is behind the assassination of Nijjar, a Canadian citizen. And of course, you heard everything else that he said. Now, 3 or 4 points were immediately made by India and by other commentators in reaction to that. Point number 1, is there any evidence at all for this, or is this just a statement that has been made? 2, if there is a terrorist or militants or extremists who are in some way getting shelter in Canada. We heard the External Affairs Ministry saying this, that Canada has given no evidence about any Indian involvement in the assassination, but there is plenty of evidence that has been given to Canada about the role that violent extremists and terrorists are creating, the havoc that they're wreaking while getting shelter of some sort in Canada. So what has Canada been doing about that is another very major question that is coming up. Third major question that is coming up is, where is this showdown going to end? Because India obviously is showing no signs at all of de-escalation. India, if anything, is escalating. Look at the remarks that have been made about visas. Look at the remarks that have been made about Canadian diplomatic presence, the expulsion of a Canadian diplomat after Canada outed and expelled an Indian diplomat. So clearly no de-escalation seems to be happening, but where is it eventually going to end up? What is going to happen with Canada's allies? What position are they going to eventually take in all of this? And by the way, there are other questions that are also arising, including the questions of hypocrisy and of ethics, and how should all of this be dealt with? Because at the end of the day, you can't really have a position in international affairs or international relations or international politics that one person's terrorist is a terrible person and somebody else's terrorist is not that bad and it's okay, and whatever he or she is saying is covered under free speech. We heard the G20 declaration. It was fairly clear on that. And why is it that I'm even referring to this? Because the same things that Canada is accusing India of allegedly having done, and I'm again going to reiterate it, India has denied it. India said we did not do it. And so far, at least, Canada has not presented any evidence that India was in any way behind this. But let's assume the worst. Let's assume the worst. What Canada is accusing India of doing, coming and killing a terrorist or a militant or an extremist in somebody else's territory. That's the worst which can be said about that, right? That's what Canada is essentially accusing India of. And we've got all of these headlines and everyone's saying this is terrible and India is becoming a rogue nation, and that is true. I guess the question that has to be asked, because it underlines a principle of international relations and international politics, is they have to be the same rules that apply to everybody. Because let's remember, when the so-called war on terror had been declared, when America was sending drones to kill people inside Iraq or in Afghanistan, when Canada joined those efforts to go into Afghanistan or into Iraq, and when people were being killed, many of those places, those were Afghan citizens being killed in Afghanistan without any judicial process, without any rule of law, without any court process. A drone would fly by and a missile would be fired and somebody would be blown up. Now, it was justified. And it was justified saying that they are terrorists and they are planning attacks on American soil or Western soil or wherever it was. That's okay. You can debate whether that's correct or whether that's not correct. But surely the same principles have to then be brought to bear across everywhere. Either you say nobody can take any action in anybody else's country without a judicial process, fair enough. In that case, whatever happened in Afghanistan or Iraq or many other countries was wrong. Or you say, oh, if somebody is a terrorist and they're about to threaten our interests, you're allowed to do X, Y, Z. In which case, it's a different principle. So I think in some way or the other, we need to arrive at what is the correct principle. Because there can't be hypocrisy. You can't say what's okay for country A is not okay for country B. But all of this, of course, presupposes the point that did this at all happen in the first place? This, for example, is what the Ministry of External Affairs said in a rather strong briefing, talking about China, about Canada's reputation as a place where extremists and terrorists are getting shelter, talking about the steps that are now being taken, and essentially saying, we've got no evidence from Canada. We have, on the other hand, given Canada enough evidence of what extremists are doing on its soil. This is what the Ministry of External Affairs said.
Let me also point out that from our side, very specific evidence about criminal activities by individuals based on Canadian soil has been shared with the Canadian authorities on a regular basis, but not been acted upon.
Well, for more on this escalating situation, we have with us Ambassador T.S. Timothy, former permanent representative of India to the United Nations, and also been former secretary to the government of India. Ambassador Timothy, thank you so much for joining us. It looks like a rather serious situation that is now developing between India and Canada, and no signs of de-escalation. If anything, it looks like it's getting worse and worse. Where do you see this headed?
Thank you once again for having me in your program, Vikram. And yes, you are absolutely right that the situation is now far more serious than at any time we have had in India-Canada relations. And given the seriousness of the situation, as we move forward or backwards, as the case may be, India needs to first and foremost make sure that Canada addresses our concerns. We have given them a long rope, and they have not done that. It has, in fact, gotten worse. Things can never really be normal unless we seize the moment and make it clear to the Canadian government that they have to change their course of action irreversibly and be sensitive to our interests and our security. And if they don't, there will be a cost to pay in terms of our relations. And that there is no better time than now to calibrate this. And that is exactly, I think, what the government is doing. And, I think it's not going to be easy at all, but the process has already started with all seriousness.
So is that why, far from backing down or being conciliatory, India seems to be perfectly happy escalating this further? And look at what's happening with visas now. Look what's the statements that are being made, reduced diplomatic presence. So India's clearly showing no signs of de-escalation in this. If anything, very happy to see where this ends up.
I look at it this way. There are three very specific disturbing trends which are there. One is terrorism, the other is religiophobia, and the third is separatism. First, on terrorism, the Canadian government has completely undermined the fight against terror by saying that those whom India considered as terrorists operating from the Canadian soil against India are in fact not terrorists. So they are actually legitimizing terror by not recognizing it. Second, in using religion, especially whipping up Hindu phobia, in other words, using religion to promote anti-India sentiments and promote hate against Hindus, against their own citizens, by the way, Canadian Hindus of Indian origin. And the third one is something we are all familiar with for decades, that is they have been unleashing anti-India separatists who are supporting Khalistan and calling for the dismemberment of India and directly hitting at our territorial integrity. So fortunately, the Khalistan agenda itself has no traction anywhere, in spite of their so-called referendum, except probably in Canada and in remnants in some Western countries. And that is why I think that the situation is very serious. And because all the three issues which I've just mentioned are coming together, and in the face of inaction by the Canadian authorities, the threat posed to India now is at a completely different level.
Ambassador Timothy, just looking at some of the points that you said to take them further, the point on terrorism and Canada disregarding Indian warnings, which then lead to terrorist attacks, it's happened in the past, like with the bombing of the Air India plane. Very clear intelligence was given. India did say that their terrorists were operating out there. Nothing happened, and an Air India plane was blown up. And on the question of what you said, religiophobia, which is taking place, we've heard people from within Trudeau's own party coming out and saying that Hindus in Canada are now getting threats saying, leave Canada and go back to India, sort of a thing.
On the question of terrorism, you're absolutely right. I mean, in fact, our spokesman just mentioned that, Canada has become a haven for terrorists. And, you've seen that at the global level, there is a fragmentation of this fight on terror. And this is something I've spoken in the UN when I was there. And I was also chair of the UN Security Council's Committee on Counterterrorism. And I spoke and I discussed this there as well. Earlier, the world was fragmented into your terrorists and my terrorists. But 9/11 changed all this, and it became a collective fight, and then we called it our terrorists. But 2 decades later, this fragmentation of the fight against terror is taking place. Europe is sort of getting preoccupied with their own so-called right-wing terror. US is getting preoccupied with what they call REMV, which is racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. And now Canada has taken it to a different level. This fragmentation of a fight, and they say that your terrorist is actually not our terrorists, since they are actually probably supporting one of their political parties or whatever, and keeping the government in power. And so I think this is a very different level of non-cooperation in fighting terror. The second aspect is that Canada itself has been completely uncooperative, with India. To many of our requests, for example, they have asked investigations into terror acts, acts against our diplomatic, and the diplomats and diplomatic premises, the tableaus which you've seen glorifying the assassins of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, criminal activities in Punjab. So you'd also seen the news which was there about 3 days ago of where a Khalistani terrorist in Canada has claimed responsibility for killing of a Congress political leader in the Punjab. And so this is really double standards, and this is unacceptable. And where is accountability in all this? I think that's why it's really dangerous, this particular situation. On your question about Hindu phobia and religiophobia, trying to fuel anti-India sentiments and converting it into a religious agenda is playing with fire. And it has actually 2 aspects to it. The first is their own separatists and terrorist groups like Sikhs for Justice, Khalistanis, and others. And they're calling for their own Indian origin Hindu Canadian citizens to leave Canada. And the Canadian government hasn't said a thing. And this is really worrying. Then what's the difference between countries where they're actually suppressing their minorities, whether they are Hindus or Christians or Sikhs, and a country like Canada, which is supposedly embracing Western values, where they are calling to do the same thing to their own minorities? I think that's one aspect of it. The second aspect is that invoking Hindu phobia is designed to bring others with a similar agenda into their fold, not just in Canada, but in US, UK, Australia, etc.
Ambassador Timothy, let me just turn my attention to the specific charge or the specific allegation that Canada is making about India being involved with the assassination on Canadian soil. No evidence so far. But supposing that evidence comes, what do you think the repercussions of that could possibly be? I'm sure India will also point to double standards, because it's not that other countries, including in the West, have not targeted terrorists on other countries' soils. But what do you think the repercussions would be?
No, let me be very frank. I don't want to speculate on such things. But let me just say that even their so-called allies, the Four Eyes Alliance or Intelligence Alliance, or whatever they have basically said these are serious allegations, and they said, please investigate further. And people are all waiting for evidence. And even today, I think our spokesperson said very clearly that they have given us no evidence. So I think it's very clear that somewhere down the line, this whole issue is being politicized. And I'm not convinced that they are going to come up with any concrete evidence trying to link up India with this type of a situation. I think this is purely a political game which is being played, and that's what it looks like. Otherwise, we would have heard a lot more from the Canadian side, and not through the television and the press, but differently.
All right, Ambassador Trimurthy, thank you so much for joining us.
So thank you very much once again.